Mark chapter 12, and this is one of my favorite passages in the Bible because this is what it all comes down to. Like, if you look at the Christian faith, this is it. Out of all of the hundreds of commandments and stipulations and regulations in the entire Bible, it all comes down to this passage right here. Mark chapter 12, verse 28 is where we will start. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, and this is the scribe asking Jesus, which commandment is the most important of all? And this is what Jesus comes back with. Verse 29. Jesus answered, the most important is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after this, no one dared to ask him any more questions. There are three things that I really want us to get from this passage today. The first, straight from the words of Jesus, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. To really give it everything that you've got, holding nothing back. By the end, you should be spent, totally gassed for God. Chariots of fire. But it's a true story based on this man, Eric Liddell. He was an Olympic athlete and a rugby player. He's a sprinter and a rugby player. His parents were missionaries, and he ended up becoming a missionary himself and gave literally everything. So I just wanted to show you a clip from this film here that was based on his early days prior to him going to the Olympics.
Gentlemen, get your marks. Get set.
Get up, lad, get up.
Come on!
Can you believe it? His head's not back yet.
Come on!
Well done, Eric. Well done. Look right neck him. And Louis and get his foot.
Eric Liddell gave 100%, right? He was gassed, collapses. But this man, like I said, was a real person in history, refused to race on Sundays because that was his day to worship. So even at the Olympics, he withdrew from certain events because they held the event on a Sunday, and he refused to race on the Lord's Day. After his career in athletics, he became a missionary himself, went overseas to serve in Asia, and during the conflict in Asia, ended up being captured and held in an internment camp and died there. And according to a fellow missionary who was with him when he died in 1945, his last words were, "It is complete surrender," talking about how he had given his whole life to God. It is complete surrender. When Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength," I think about guys like Eric Little, who literally gave everything he had, everything within him, holding nothing back. This is a man who loved God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second thing that we need to pick up is what Jesus tacks onto this. He says the first thing is to love God with everything that you are. He says, and then the second one is this, to love your neighbor as yourself. In verse 31, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there's no commandment greater than these. So Jesus says, here's the first piece, love God with everything you are, don't hold anything back. But the second, it's not, nothing should supersede God. However, here's number two, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus himself gave an illustration of this when he talked about the Good Samaritan. Good Samaritan says this, there was a Jewish man traveling and he was waylaid by robbers. They beat him up, took all the stuff and left him for dead, side of the road. Pretty soon there was another Jewish man coming up. He worked at the temple and he saw the man lying in a ditch, dying. He's like, oh, that's too bad, but if I touch him, then I'll be unclean and then I can't go worship, so I'm not going to stop and help him. Then a second man came up and saw him. It's like, oh, I really got to get on my way. I feel bad about it, but I'm just not going to, I can't do anything about it right now. And so I wish him well, but I'm just going to keep going. Then finally a Samaritan comes, not a Jewish person. And the Jewish people hated the Samaritans. They saw them as illegitimate people of the faith, an offshoot, not true believers. They called them dogs, which is a huge insult. Not like, yo, dog, what's up? That was a terrible insult. It doesn't get any lower in the Middle Eastern culture to call someone a dog. So the Jewish people referred to Samaritans as dogs. But this Samaritan person comes up, sees a Jewish man lying on the side of the road, beaten, dying, takes him, wraps his wounds, then takes him to an inn and pays the innkeeper to look after the man. Says, hey, take care of him, and I'll be back in a few days, and if there's anything else on the bill, I'll take care of that too. And Jesus says, which one of these three men was really a neighbor to the injured man? Well, the answer is obvious. It's the one who stopped and helped him, acted in a neighborly fashion. They weren't buddies. They didn't have anything in common. In fact, they would see each other on the street as enemies. And yet still, this is the one who acted as a neighbor. And so when Jesus tells this story, he asks his audience, which one of these guys was the true neighbor? Oh, the Samaritan was. And Jesus says, you go and do the same. And Jesus says, who is your neighbor? The person that we come upon. It doesn't matter if we agree with them. In fact, if you were to take modern examples and put them into Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, a grand wizard from the KKK is beaten, robbed, and left for dead on the side of the road. All right? And the person who comes up and helps him is an African-American man whose family has been disenfranchised and persecuted by the Klan. But he stops and helps the Grand Wizard. Someone who would be diametrically opposed, actively seeking bad things for you in your life. Jesus would say, this is what it means to be a neighbor, to care for people. Or you have someone who wears a red MAGA hat, beaten up, lying on the side of the road. And a very, very left-leaning Democrat walks up and sees the person. The neighborly thing to do is to say, I'm going to care for you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to bind your wounds and make sure that you have what you need. See, we can pick lots of different examples in our culture and our society of people that would not normally be friends. And Jesus says this is what it means to be a neighbor, to care for people who are unable to care for themselves, to seek the good and the well-being of other people. Our love for others should lead us to compassionate action. It's not just enough to say, I love you. That doesn't go far enough. But it has to be accompanied with actual concrete behavior. And that's the third piece that is so important that Jesus is teaching us. It's this inseparable link between loving God and loving people. The link is everything. It's not enough just to love God and to treat other people like garbage. It's not enough to treat people well, but not love God. They're connected. In the Bible, 1 John chapter 4, whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. So loving God is important, but it has to be followed up with how we treat other people. So let us regularly check our heart, asking, am I loving other people the way I should? Not just the people who look like me, who think like me, who agree with me, the people who like me, but people who would consider me their enemy. Am I loving them? Am I taking care of them? Because love in the Bible is not a feeling. I'm not asking you to feel good things to your enemies. In the Bible, love is not how we feel, it's how we behave. See, our world thrives on chaos and rage. It does the world good to keep pushing outrage and anger because it motivates people. And Jesus says, forget all of that. That's nonsense. Love God and love people. And that needs to play out in how we behave. Loving people means taking care of them, even when we disagree. That is godly love. Because that's the kind of love God demonstrates for us. We don't earn it, we don't deserve it, and God still loves us. And that's what He calls us to do to the world around us.